esta tarde, why C-levels should be involved in technology issues. Curt Burmeister, Chief Technology Officer, SS&C Algorithmics. Jean-Martin Carrier, Head of Business Development de Murex Latinoamérica. Y como anfitrión, tenemos el orgullo de recibir con nosotros a Tom Severance, Global Head of Account Management and Sales de International Cash Distributors, ICD. Agradecemos a SS&C Algorithmics por hacer posible esta mesa redonda. Welcome Curt, Jean-Martin, and Tom to the Risk Management and Trading Conference 2021.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for having us and joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Riskmatics, for all you've done to put together a fantastic conference and putting together this panel. With Curt and Jean here, we have a super opportunity to really understand what really happens between technology decisions and the C-level. And so let's dive right in, since you've already been introduced. Curt, you know, you're somebody who's been kind of on both sides of this decision process. You've introduced C-level people into technology decisions, but you've also now sit on the C-level, and you're the one approving these decisions. How important is it that the C-level is involved in these decisions?
Yeah, so Tom, I think there's sort of three reasons why you might invest in new technology. You want to increase revenue, you want to reduce costs, or you want to reduce risk, right? And if you think about those three things, revenue, cost, and risks, those are C-level topics, right? And so taking that lens on making a technology decision is really important. And so, you know, when I think about things now, it's do we have the right business plan? Have we put the right scope around it? What are our objectives? How are we going to manage our costs? And what are the risks that are inherent in this project? You know, are we trying to meet a regulatory requirement and we have a deadline? So, you know, have we built enough buffer into the timeline? So taking that view from those three perspectives, I think, is really important. And so, you know, I'd say from a C-level perspective, there's sort of three recommendations that I would make to somebody who's involved in a technology related decision. Like, first of all, invest enough time to learn the basics of the technology. You don't need to be an expert, but you need to know enough to ask good questions. All right, so that's number one. So when, you know, if you think about moving to cloud, you know, what is Docker, what is Kubernetes, what are those things at a very high level, not how they operate, but what are they and how they fit together? And so you can ask the question, you know, what's this going to cost, right? And when you get an answer back, you can understand why, right? And that's recommendation number one. Recommendation number two is stay informed on the project. So, I'm a CTO, so when I think about things, you know, I might want to be, and I am on certain alerts. So when severity one or outages happen, I know about it. Now I'm not fixing them, but I'm looking for patterns, right? Are there certain things that we should be aware of and dealing with, right? And I also get a lot of weekly summaries. Here's the status of these projects over the last week. Here's the issues we've had, here are the successes. So staying informed and looking for patterns, right? Are there things that we can systematically change? And that comes with the third recommendation. Be in the position to provide that governance, right? When you're in a C-level, you're providing governance. You're not doing it, but you're providing governance. That means you need to be able to provide regular feedback. So make sure there are steering committees that you can, you know, make sure projects stay on track. And, you know, when things don't work out or start to wander, can you bring the right resources to bear? And, you know, if you think about cloud, and I guess use that example because that's one that's very common, and a lot of people are doing migrations to cloud, you know, the types of resources you might need are you know, the experts in networking, or the experts in security, or the experts in the application that you're moving, right? And you need to bring them to the table to deal with the right, you know, issues and keep things on trouble. So the recommendations are, you know, from a C-level, make sure you learn enough so that you can ask good questions, stay informed over time, and then be able to provide the right governance and feedback to the project, and make sure you're steering the ship and staying on target. So that's
excellent recommendations. Appreciate that, Curt. Shifting a bit over to Jean. So those are three, I think, really interesting concepts and recommendations. you kind of come at this from having seen both the good and bad of the C-suite getting involved. Probably seen a lot of projects where lack of C-suite involvement has caused problems, or maybe even sometimes the C-suite making bad recommendations. So from your perspective, how important is it, and how do you get the C-suite involved when you've got a large project in front of you?
Thank you, Tom, for the question, and for Rhysmatics for the invitation. And I think you're right. I think there's it needs to be looked at in two different ways. First, as Curt was mentioning some of the points why C-level executives need to get involved, and Curt mentioned savings, revenue, risk. I think there's one more to that list, which is reputation and security, and I think that one is probably a bit more recent. But I mean, when we talk with C-level executives in the region, we do hear a lot about those four topics. And again, I think the reputation and security one has become a big part of C-level executives' agendas. So that's one way of looking at why C-level executives need to get involved. And if you see in those four topics, technology is a key enabler. I mean, just to give you an example, in terms of cost savings, we've seen a lot of acceleration in capital markets of banks moving to cloud flavors. A few years back, having banks and capital market players executing cloud initiatives was still, not a dream, but it was still far away. Nowadays, we see that has, accelerated quite a lot. We actually have a client in Latam who moved all their production environments and all their non-production environments to the cloud, and in a bit less than a year, they've achieved almost 25% of savings. So, I mean, you can see how those things are accelerating, and most probably the last 18 months, because of the pandemic, are contributing to that acceleration in this new business context. But there's another block on how to look at this, and which is, as you said, what happens when C-level executives don't get involved? What are the negatives when they don't get involved? And I see three, I would say, clear examples. First one is about selection processes. When you get selection processes where C-level executives are not involved from the very beginning, those selection processes tend to be long, requirements tend to change in the middle. So at the end of the day, you get a lot of frustration from all the involved, the bank, the vendors, the partners. So it's key that decision-making process comes from a top-down approach. Okay, otherwise it tends to be a bit less efficient. The other example has to do with governance and project execution, and Curt rightly mentioned that one as well. And we see that if you don't get the guidance, support, visibility of C-level executives in the governance and execution through the life of the project, things start to be more volatile. And I think one of the key points there is that, I mean, they don't need to be leading the governance or the execution of the project, but they do need to stay present and get involved, because when things go south, you need to react quickly. And that reaction, when it comes from the top level executives, allows for the project to get back on course. Okay. The third one is not about technology, it's actually about people. I mean, technology is important, but the people that work with you to put that technology into work is fundamental. So C-level executives, when they don't take care of the people consideration, that's when we also see struggles in projects, execution, and transformation initiatives. And I think it's about identifying the people within your organization, and you need to dedicate them so that they can be productive in the project, because if they're doing two things at the same time, it tends not to work. But it's also about identifying the right partners. So companies you can work with, people that are close to you, that know the local complexity, the local requirements, and that have the experience of covering those. And when you have that combination of technology and the right people, then you avoid a lot of issues down the road.
Very interesting. I think, one of the things I've noticed in the States is that a lot of the CTOs are similar to guys like Curt now, who actually are people who fully understand the technologies, have come up through the system, building things on their own and knowing what's happening with technology going forward. And that's becoming a big trend in the States, to hire CTOs who have those skills. Is that the same trend in Latin America, Sean?
So in terms of the level of involvement, I would say that C-level executives in LATAM, they do get involved, and I think it's a question of they like it or not, they are involved in some of the capital markets transformation initiatives we get involved in. The size of that initiative for the bank is considerable. They represent a big chunk either of their budget or their strategic decisions. So, like I said, they do get involved. They like it or not, even if it's just because they need to sign the check. Okay, I think the question here is, how do they get involved? Do they proactively get involved so that they can convey that top-down approach with a vision and they contribute and facilitate that vision? Or is it a bottom-up approach where teams are asking them for this and that, and then it tends to become a little less efficient? Okay, and I mean, here in Mexico, we have two close examples where that top-down approach has worked quite well. We have a couple of, like I said, initiatives, big, large transformation projects for these two banks. In the one hand, the CEO is the sponsor and is active and is visible throughout the project. And on the other hand, it's the CIO who's doing the same sort of work. But both initiatives are progressing well. It has its little ups and downs, but the variability and the risk of those, we can see it directly that it's minimized or contained because these guys are visible and active throughout the life of the project.
That's very interesting. Thanks for that. I think talking about big project is probably a good way of a lens into this whole concept of the C-suite being involved or not involved. And one of the biggest changes for most people is the shift over to cloud and the decision as to whether you, what I would call lift and shift, or build natively on the cloud. And if you think about lift and shift, if I took a tugboat, took the engine out and put a speedboat engine in the tugboat, I'd have a faster tugboat, but I probably wouldn't win the speed races, right? So I guess, how do big companies make these type of decisions as to jumping into the internet or jumping into the cloud as a moving everything over or rebuilding? Curt, can you maybe talk us through how people think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big challenge. And I think, if you think about what some of the keys to success on any technology initiative, especially if it's a new one, you need the right skills. You need to change the culture and the way you think about things, and you need to put the right processes in place. And so when you talk about lift and shift versus cloud native, I think one of the key factors is, do you have the skills to go cloud native out of the box, or is a lift and shift strategy more practical? And if you come back to some of those C-suite level thinking, what's the level of risk we want to take on this project, right? So I would say that would be sort of one assessment. The second thing is instilling a change in culture and a new way of thinking. And just to use cloud as an example, we're used to having data centers, traditional data centers, where the machines have been purchased and there's a fixed capacity, and they're there and people can use them and however they want. And suddenly you go to the cloud world where there's sort of unlimited resources in a sense. And what you find is that people start turning on machines, and maybe they leave, big clusters running over the weekend in a dev process that they're not using, and you're like, hold on a second, what did that cost, right? And so, you got to change the way you think about development now. Do you make sure that excess capacity that's really valuable is scaled down when you're not using it? And that's not the way a traditional development team thinks about it. They think about a fixed capacity that they work within. So sort of changing that culture. And then what are the processes that you put in place to manage that? So, what alerts do you have on your costs? What alerts do you have that machines are up and running that may not be using, or that you may have over provisioned? And so I'm sort of focusing on a sort of negative side, but these are the kinds of things that you think about. And if you want to have a successful project, you got to make sure you have that right culture, and that you're thinking about, do I want to subscribe to a service, or do I want to build the equivalent, right? And think about databases as a service as a classic example. And this is something that we in our own development organization thinks about. Do I want to use the development service that's provided, the database service that's provided by the cloud vendor, right? And with that, I get a bunch of benefits, right? Or at the stage where I am, is it better just to deploy a VM, install the database myself, and manage it myself, right? So one is cloud native, one is more of a lift and shift type of approach, and where you fall on that spectrum really can be different depending on the project, depending on your skills, depending on, do you have the processes in place to manage it? I personally believe that at the end of the day, going to the cloud services is the way to go. Going cloud native is the way to go. But you got to get there, right? And so it's not an easy first step, because it is such a different way of thinking about things, and it does require a change in culture and an innovation in the processes and controls that you put around how you do basic things like development that's been going on for years. You just do it differently on the cloud, right? And so those are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about from the C-level to when making those decisions between sort of the lift and shift and cloud native.
Okay, but as a CTO, and you're worried about your current products and how you're going to shift them, aren't you also thinking about other products that are out there that might solve the problem or might come in and compete with what you have? I mean, Jean, you're a huge company with a huge footprint. How do you keep the natively built guys in the garage from taking over your business?
So, clearly, there's an explosion in the fintech world. So it's fascinating to see how the ecosystem is evolving, the new things that are coming into the market. So definitely a very interesting time in the technology space, at least in capital markets. Interesting as well, though, is that we are seeing that because of regulation in the segment we operate, in Murex, in the capital market segment, we do see that regulation is pushing banks to sort of intertwine areas like front office, risk, and even back office, because they need to keep consistent valuation engines and to keep a consistent front to risk approach. And in particular, I'm thinking about FRTB, where there is this push from the regulator to the front office area and the risk area to stay consistent on how they approach the valuation, the curves, etc. FRTB is an example. Another example could be IFRS. We see the same. If IFRS is sort of pushing front, risk, even accounting to stay consistent across the whole workflow to be able to properly prepare their hedge accounting requirements. And the reason I'm citing these examples is even if there is a booming ecosystem of new application, some of the drivers in the market are pushing to an area where I think Murex is very well positioned and has a very well value proposition to help our clients, which is the integrated front to back to risk platform. And again, this case of front and risk being intertwined because of regulation, like FRTB is a clear example. And having that integrated platform allows you to have a consistent way of pricing and valuing your positions, a consistent set of curves, a consistent set of trades, a consistent set of things like collateral management, contract definitions, and that makes the process more efficient. And by process, I mean adapting to regulation, but also growing, because every time you need to throw or want to push a new product into the marketplace, you can do it so with a consistent starting point. Okay, we do see other architecture designs by some of our clients where they tend to choose different applications for different requirements, and in some of those cases we tend to see pains associated with the architecture, because we see clients that need to invest in maintaining different applications, maintaining different integrations, and even I guess even more costly to conciliate or reconcile the valuations of the different little items they have spread across the capital market system. So for that reason, I think the value proposition of Murex is consistent with some of the trends. But there is one angle where we are collaborating with our clients where we do see space for applications, for specific specialized applications. And that area for us has to do with specific risk indicators that are very computational intensive, and in particular XVA. When we talk about XVA, and in particular things like MVA or the sensitivities behind those XVAs, you need to be very careful on how you prepare to compute those, because you could multiply by X factor the hardware requirements of your infrastructure. So for those particular cases, what Murex has developed for the market is a specialized application where the burden of the calculation is done by a business process as a service, by a BPaaS. So you still benefit from having a core managing your front to back requirements, but when it's time to launch a computational intensive requirement, we have this app based on a BPaaS approach that computes the indicator, sends it back, you keep it consistent, and you avoid the burden of the hardware infrastructure. So it's a little bit of trying to match the best of both worlds. Tom.
So, I mean, that's quite interesting, and I'm kind of almost wanting to debate you a little bit on this, because I do realize that your goal is to own the entire front to back, and I think that's great, and I think you guys have done an amazing job of that. But there are applications that are coming out that are super fast calculation engines or super fast access to building yield curves or getting data, and a lot of that is now done through APIs, which are quite well documented and easy to get at. I mean, Curt, how do you make sure that somebody isn't going to come along and be the BPaaS for everything that Murex does in the future, right? Or everything that SS&C does in the future?
Right. So, our approach is to put our capabilities in microservices, right, that can be called from any application, right? So it allows to address some of the consistency issues that John was talking about. It talks about some of the scalability issues. So, in the XVA problem in particular is, very computationally intensive. And so by taking that calculation and exposing it on a cloud-based API, you can dial up or dial down those compute resources on demand. And right, so our approach has been to build a cloud strategy, in particular around, going cloud native with discrete decomposable services around the core components that you do in a risk management application, be it scenario generation, simulation, etc. And then, yes, we package them together in solutions around market risk, credit risk, etc. But because they are now cloud native services that anybody can subscribe to, the client can choose to mix and match and embed them in their own workflows. So it enables and exposes that core technology in a way that doesn't rely on the vendor, on us to package it in a certain way, right? And so this is an example of where the cloud technology, yes, it's about compute and about scalability, and especially important in risk management, right? Because of the asynchronous, compute resources where, you have overnight runs that are very expensive from a core perspective, and you don't need those cores during the day. So you have that cyclical, compute. So the cloud is really, really good and applicable for risk management. But once you put it in this sort of microservice framework, you can now start to say, hey, I want to take the risk numbers that I use for FRTB and I want to put them in some other system. It really makes that easy. And I say easy, but it makes it achievable in a way that just wasn't possible. So here's an example where moving to cloud native, the first objective was how do we take advantage of the scalability for the problem of risk management, right? Because you just need a lot of compute resources, but you need them overnight, you need them at the end of the month, et cetera. It's very cyclic. Once you go to microservice architecture, how else can you use those analytics? And what you find is, and what our clients are finding is that there's a lot of other ways that they can use those analytics, right? And it's not just about computing an FRTB report anymore or a credit report. It's about, hey, taking those numbers and putting them in with my accounting system, et cetera, et cetera. So going cloud native and going to that sort of cloud native architecture starts to open up the do more aspect of this technology. So originally cloud was all about saving costs, right? It's now about business agility and what else can I do, right? And what you're seeing is from, again, brings back to the C-level, right? The original motivation for cloud was around cost savings. You go back, a few years, that's what the primary principal driver was. But now what we're seeing is it's about business agility. How can I do more and do with shorter projects, shorter implementation, shorter, et cetera? How can I drive that revenue side of the equation, right? And so you're seeing that shift and having a cloud native architecture, and this helps you drive those types of discussions around, new business agility, new workflows, et cetera.
All right, so Jean, question for you. We talked about, cloud native, we talked about APIs, we talked about asynchronous use of machines, we talked about cores. I think we also mentioned something about microservices. I'm the CEO or the CFO or the chief information officer at a big bank, and my trader's telling me I need my XVA calculations faster. I mean, how am I going to determine, what these people are telling me and make any decision that makes sense?
So, and that particular XVA case, I think it's very relevant because we've seen that in the region for the last 2-3 years are becoming one of, I would say, the hot topics. Okay, so if you're asking me a bit about the debate, the philosophical debate of C-level executives in terms of whether to buy or build, so as to cover their business requirement in LATAM, so in our visibility, or at least my visibility in what I see in the market, is that there are a few banks that want to compete by differentiation, and that pushes them towards preferring a build, okay? But we do see maybe a stronger trend around buy, and I'll try to explain why. And this example of XVA is quite useful. In the last 2-3 years, we've seen, or we received a lot of clients asking us about, we need to better compete with international banks that are coming into our market and trying to steal our corporate clients because they're able to provide better derivatives pricing. And one of the reasons they're able to do so is because in the corporate head office, these big, large players, powerhouses like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan's have, massive infrastructures, massive teams of quants, and they can leverage that, to try to penetrate other markets and steal those corporate clients from local banks by pricing derivatives more aggressively. So we received these concerns from our clients in LATAM, and what we have been doing at what they've been asking us to do is to help them better compete. And to do that, we've invested with them, and we've managed to provide them with the tools so that they can even up the playing field when competing against some of these powerhouses. And we've done some of those projects with LATAM local banks to a point where they have turned it into an advantage, because one of the things they can do with these solutions that vendors like us can provide them is that we've been able to also reflect the local market particularities that are super important when pricing derivatives. And I mean, for example, in Mexico, Chile, Colombia, we have these inflation indexes like the UD, the UF, and if you're able to properly address those in your models, you are obtaining a more specific pricing for your derivatives, so you can better compete with your clients. So in that sense, like I said, the fact that sometimes or most of the times these guys in LATAM local banks tend to compete against international banks, we are in a good position to help them with with a built solution rather than them trying to invest millions and millions of dollars in developing themselves.
That makes some sense. I completely understand. I mean, it's a packaged solution that makes it easier for anyone who doesn't want to have to do a whole lot of build. But I guess, Curt, I'll turn it back to you. Is there a hybrid here where, the new technology that comes in that somebody looks at and says, wow, this is really the next generation of calculation capability, or the next generation of being able to move data back and forth? How do companies like SS&C and Murex, either adopt, not adopt, choose to adopt, and what does that mean for, the C-suite at the bank? How do they know that you're keeping up and they should keep working with companies like yours?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ideas that come to mind when thinking about that particular question. And first of all, this is a very rapidly evolving space, and we're focusing this conversation on cloud, but we could have it on AI or any one of a number of topics that are quite similar, right? So, when it comes particularly to cloud, there's a lot of innovation happening in the fintech space, but there's also a lot of innovation that's just happening in the technology space, and staying on top of it is really challenging at times, right? And so especially if you're in a bank and your business is around capital markets, learning about all this cloud stuff and staying on top of it is not probably your primary responsibility. And so I strongly think that the technology companies, the Murexes, the Algorithmics of the world, I mean, they're building solutions, right? And so it's our job to make sure that we're staying on top of the technology innovations, right? It's also our job to communicate, how we're doing that and what our roadmaps are for onboarding new technologies across the board. And so like I said previously, we've adapted this microservices approach, right, as a way, as a strategy, right? And what that enables us to do, though, is very easily change the underlying technology. So, I'm going to go back to the example of database technologies. There's a lot of database technologies out there, right? And you can now start to get them as services, right? So you don't have to actually go provision your VM or your machine and install the database and have a DBA and manage it. You can actually get the service, right? But if you look at all the different vendors out there providing databases as a service, right, either directly or through a major cloud vendor, right, there's a lot of decisions there, right? And so at a certain level, does it matter to the bank or the end user of the technology what is the underlying database? No, I would argue no, right? What really matters is, is it performant? Do you have disaster recovery? Do you have redundancy, right? Is the data secure? Right? Are you complying with all regional data governance laws that apply? Right? Those are the issues that matter. And talking about it in those terms are terms that CEO or the CTO or the business person on the banking or capital market side can understand, right? And so what I would suggest is that, the technology companies, they should be looking at these different options and evaluating what's best for the strategy that they've adopted, right? But making sure that it has the right business properties, right? And again, I come back to, when you talk about data in particular, it's security, it's disaster recovery, it's where does the data's residency, where does the data reside? Are you complying with all regulations, et cetera, and being able to ensure that you're meeting those business objectives is what matters the most when communicating, to the, in our case, the bank who's the client.
And John, that's not very far from what you were kind of arguing, that Murex takes on the burden of worrying about all of the details behind the scenes and making sure that you provide the service to the end client, which is really the goal. But is there, a concern going forward that a new technology will come along that will get ahead of everyone else, and it won't be able to easily be adapted for companies like yours? And should the bank care? Is it something that will take off for the bank or not?
So again, I think Curt mentioned it quite rightfully, and the level of speed at which technology is moving obliges us, and I mean the C-level executives of the banks, our clients, and us as vendor, to stay alert, to stay on our toes, to be what our CEO calls reasonably paranoid, because things move very fast, and you need to be informed. And again, Curt said it very well at the beginning, you need to stay informed. And in that context, besides the examples I mentioned earlier, there's obviously an innovation lab where we are identifying those trends and working on to make sure that we pick up on the right trends, right segments, right requirements to focus our efforts on. And one of those particular segments or niches goes back to these computational requirements for complex derivatives and the indicators that you need to produce as a bank, like XVA, MVA, sensitivities, and so forth. So I talked about BPAS before, but one of the other areas that also is trendy, and it's part of the work we are doing in our innovation lab, has to do with IA, and neural networks to approximate some of these complex risk indicators. And the idea is, again, using AI and neural network approach to come up with a good enough approximation that it's business useful, so that the trading desks and the salespeople at the derivatives desk can use, but it prevents or helps you avoid the computational burden of what we've been discussing about, increasing the hardware just to get it done. So that's one aspect. The other, it's a combination of technology and operating model. Okay. And one of the things we've been working on with our clients is to facilitate the upgrade processes behind these solutions. We know that the market is going very fast in terms of changes, regulation, even more. So we need to make sure we give the tools and the operating model to our clients to be able to keep up, with those enhancements and upgrades. And in that sense, there's a couple of things that we've been doing. One is working on the tools that automate test and that puts configuration as code and not just as hard code. So we call that continuous integration, continuous development. And we use that in combination with an operating model where we provide the automated testing processes and the upgrade processes, so that instead of receiving enhancement every once in a while, you do this constantly. We have a major bank in the US that has done 6 major releases upgrades in the last 2 years, which for capital markets, it's a very aggressive frequency for upgrades. But that, for instance, allowed them to run thousands of tests in minutes, to deploy environments in minutes instead of weeks. So like you said, you need to stay on your toes, you need to be reasonably paranoid, and then choose which fights you want to go after, and and react accordingly.
It's interesting you're talking about the release schedule. The company I'm with now, we're a portal for investing in money market funds. So we have 400 of the largest corporates and asset managers in the world, all investing their instant cash through us into money market funds. We do releases every 2 weeks, and it's consistent. We're fully agile, and we, occasionally we've rolled back a release here or there, but in general, we're releasing new functionality to all of our clients every 2 weeks, and that's just because we're a younger shop than everybody else, and we've only been developing since 2010. So we've been able to be agile from the beginning, and it works quite well. It's all microservices as well, which makes it very easy to do that. But I recognize that is not what the real world for most of our clients is. They have inherent systems that don't have that capability. I guess I'd like to shift a little bit, since you did bring up AI and some other technologies, and Curt was talking about canonical databases and different ways that people are doing things these days. What should the C-suite be looking for and looking out for in terms of new technologies? You mentioned neural networks, which has been around since the 60s, but now we can suddenly use it because the compute power is there. That's great. But, how is that going to impact the C-suite decision making? Not just that particularly, but in general, Curt, what should happen here in terms of what are the technologies, or what are the new things that the C-suite should be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so AI is definitely one. I think there are different applications of AI, and it's one that in certain spaces it's really, really powerful, and in others, we're still developing, the methodology. So, one place where we're using it is the area of scenario generation, right? So, this pandemic hit us 18 months ago or whatever, approximately 18 months ago, and we went about and developed a methodology for using pandemic variables to generate economic scenarios that could then be used to run market risk and credit risk scenarios. But we used an AI in that approach to look at how do you look at number of cases in a particular country, how many recoveries, how many deaths, how do you take those pandemic variables and turn them into an economic scenario that can be used to value a bond or any other security, right? And so this is an area where we took AI and said, hey, we can use it in this way. You can also think about AI as a way to take, news articles, extract sentiment from them, and generate economic scenarios, right? So there's in the risk space, there's some really good places where AI can help. It's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all kinds of problems, but there are very targeted places where it makes a lot of sense. And so, understanding where AI can be applied, at least to the space that we're in of risk management, is really important. And sort of staying on top of, where, again, back to the innovators in the fintech, who are the companies that are specializing on this and can provide services that can be, again, going back to the cloud native market microservice architecture approach, where can I take a service that's provided by a third-party company embedded into my technology stack to provide value, say, around a scenario generation? How might I provide an extreme but plausible scenario generation, a 1 in 50-year event, right? And how might I take AI and apply it to that problem? How might I look at climate risk, which is incredibly hard to measure these days? How might I look at ESG, variables, which, again, the studies are out there that, depending on who the ESG rating company is, you can be scored very high or very low. There's a lot of volatility in those ratings, but they're extremely important. So how do I look at all the different ratings out there and and somehow bring them together into some composite score that can be used for a risk management process. So there's lots of new challenges out there, and AI is one of them. It's one technology, it's one place, but you have to look at where it's applicable and to what problem you're trying to solve.
Okay, just before we get to questions, thanks for that, Curt. I want to give Jean a chance to kind of chime in on this topic, but I will throw out one thing. Can you use AI to understand the crypto market so that we can all figure out what's going on there? No, I'm just kidding. But that does bring up blockchain, and that was a big one for a while. So, Jean, I'll turn it over to you. What do you think about all these new technologies, and what should the C-suite be worried about?
So no, I was going to make a joke that I know the answer to your previous questions, but I'm going to keep it for myself. But yeah, I mean, in the discussion, we've been talking about cloud, and Curt has been sharing a lot of context and useful information about cloud adoption. And maybe I can take these 2-3 minutes before the Q&A session to give a bit of feedback on what we've seen in LATAM in terms of cloud adoption. Because as I said at the beginning, 3, 4, 5 years ago, a lot of people in LATAM trade and risk management space were talking about cloud, but nobody was executing, cloud-related projects. So that's, I think, one aspect that has been changing, okay, and has been changing dramatically and is clearly accelerating. The other important aspect is that when we talk about cloud, we might run the risk of thinking cloud one-size-fits-all type of solution, and I think we are far from there. And that's what I'd like to introduce, the concept of journey to cloud. So every client will have first a different strategy, and second, a different stage of maturity of that strategy in the cloud. So you have clients that are beginning to move to infrastructure as a service. They are taking just the hardware from their data center on house to AWS or Microsoft Azure or whichever vendor they work with. And from there, we have another set of potential evolution and steps in the journey to cloud, what our clients might be. So again, I think it's important to realize that this is something that is not one size fits all approach. Okay. Maybe more interestingly is the recent acceleration that we have seen in the market, where clients were not making any moves in this space. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we now have several clients that have moved either their test environments and production environments to the cloud, or just one of those pieces, and we continue to see those more and more. And probably even more interesting, when we now talk with new prospects or clients, Tier 3 banks, when they come up to us with their project, the strategy is SaaS first. They have clearly realized that in their segment of competitiveness in the market, they want to leverage all these abilities, agility, and experience from their vendors and partners to go to SaaS from the very beginning and leverage or remove the complexity of infrastructure from their decision. So from our side, what we try to do, just to finish, is to, depending on the step of the cloud journey these clients are, we have specific value proposition and experience we can share to help them and guide them through the journey.
That was excellent. Thank you. Pretty interesting. And it's good to hear the LATAM perspective, since everyone in the audience is mostly from LATAM. I think we'll turn it over for questions now. I think we have about 10 minutes left. Do we have questions in the audience?
Jess, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here. And the first question we have is one of the main threats we find.
I wanted to throw a question at you guys, Curt and Tom, based on a comment I made at the beginning, whereby I've seen that security and reputation has become also one of the top topics in the C-level agendas. What's your view on that? And what has been your experience around that topic that it's becoming like one of those in the priority list?
I mean, I'll start on that because I think it is a critical
on,
piece
please.
for all.
Absolutely.
It's a great question, and I do think it's one that's very pertinent in today's world when you look around and see all of the hacking that's going on and all the hostage holding that's going on through technology means. Everyone who has customer data needs to be concerned about that, right? And it is probably the top of everyone's list. And I'm not sure that there's a golden bullet anywhere, because the minute we all put in the latest and greatest pieces that we have, there's going to be somebody else who's going to try to hack a new way in or get a new way in. But putting that as the number one priority on any new decision that you make around software or any decision you make about buying something, bringing in new technologies is absolutely critical in my view. And I think that every CTO now understands that, and every CISO is pushing harder and harder to really dig into the software before they do anything. Curt?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo those comments. So certainly, as we develop systems, it's what we're thinking about when we have client data. Security is, a number one topic because of the reputational risk, and obviously, you're entrusted with client data, you need to protect it. I think the other observation is that, if you look at RFPs, RFIs coming in from institutions, there's a lot of security questions, right? And it's now a major section, right? And sometimes they are prescribed, can you meet these objectives? And other times they're like, well, what do you do? And so it's becoming, one of those sections of the RFP, RFI that you really have to spend a lot of time on and make sure that, if you have a SaaS model and you're offering a SaaS offering, can you meet the various hurdles? And, some of them can be dealt with through a SOC 2 compliance or some approach like that. But in general, it is a major thing, and we're seeing it on almost we're seeing it on every single RFP that we get. Like, security is a section onto itself.
Well, thank you. Thank you to both. One of the questions we have from the audience is how to get out of the box and start a new business model from scratch. It becomes so difficult for a C-level to do this. Please, who wants to answer it?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about some things I've seen in a few companies. I've seen companies take a twofold strategy. So the twofold strategy is, make sure that what I have continues to work for the exact same time period that I'm building my new infrastructure or technology, so that I almost have a crossing path, right? Where as I'm winding down what's happening in my old technology, my new technology meets the criteria that I need and starts giving me that advantage going forward. And that's not an easy thing to do, but it is probably the only strategy for some people who are sitting with quite old technology that can't really just be shifted and turned into modern architecture.
Curt, Jan, would you like to address it?
Yeah, the thing that I would add is that, coming back to some of the points I made earlier about skills and culture and new way of thinking, that, something that we've done successfully multiple times in the past is setting up a dedicated, isolated team that specializes in that particular technology, sort of an incubation stage to get started. If you have people that's what they're going to do, and they're not burdened with running the old system or the old constraints, that is a good way of bootstrapping a new technology adoption or project or evaluation. Having that incubation team that it's ring fenced, and that's what they're focused on. And it can be one or two people. It doesn't have to be a large team at the beginning. And as it gains momentum and the understanding about what those benefits are, then it can change. But it really is hard to take an existing team that has a day job focused on running an existing business and sort of have them pivot and on the side, figure out a new way of doing stuff. So, what we've done several times successfully is basically form an innovation team to look at a particular topic.
Well, today, talking about technology, it is not just about involvement or to get involved with technology. Or in your viewpoint, most C-levels, how must they start think digitally? Instead of involvement, how to start thinking digitally? How to drive this cultural change inside the organization? And I think, Jan, you have lived things on this viewpoint in Latin America.
So yes, and actually you already answered part of the question, and it has to do with cultural change. I mean, when you're driving your business, but you want to change the dynamic on how you compete or how you differentiate yourself in the marketplace, there's one important aspect that has to do with culture. And again, this goes back to one of the comments I made earlier about the importance of people in transformation programs. And C-level executives need to drive that cultural change. And one of the things that need to happen or that they need to drive is identifying the right people to make that change. And identifying the right people has to do with your own organization, but as well as the companies you partner with. And, for instance, in LATAM, when we address and help some of the banks we work with to transform the digital markets practice from very manual processes, Excels and so forth, into a more robust and structured approach and operating model. They count on us not only to provide the technology, but to guide them because of experience from other clients, best practices we've seen in similar projects with other banks. So again, I think one of the main drivers is cultural change, and for that, people, internal and partners are key.
Well, I already heard all you talking about as issues: innovation, risk measurement, technology of environment, productivity, customer service, operation visibility, operations automation, performance management, scalability, competitiveness. But I would like to ask you in this last minute, why not to focus on a strategy, on the strategy needed for the time, for the moment we are living and facing in this world? Who would like to talk about it?
I'll jump in for a second, and then I'll let
Please.
the others go ahead. So best laid plans, everyone had a strategy coming into 2020, and that strategy probably changed. And I think all of us realized that suddenly strategies are a great concept, but they're made to be adapted. When you think about strategy and how that is related to technology, your business strategy should be the same. Your business strategy should be focused and continue. You need to then leverage technologies that can help you enhance that business strategy as you go. And this is where I think it's critical for the CTO to actually understand the business and not just be a CTO. And this is where the C-suite needs to not just be strategy people, but they also need to understand technology and how that can help the strategy. So the world is a little different. It used to be, here's our strategy, somebody go build on that. Well, you know what? With some of these new technologies, you can change your strategy quickly and disrupt markets that you didn't think you could disrupt, because the technology allows you to do that today.
Thank you very much, Tom, Curt, Jan. It has been more than a pleasure for us to have you here. Really a great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us. We always love being with Matt.
Good afternoon. And good. Y bueno, pues Claudia, Gerardo, qué gusto volver a tenerlos aquí en el escenario, en el set. Gerardo, es tiempo de hablar de los patrocinadores.
Sí, agradecemos a nuestros patrocinadores sin los cuales no hubiéramos podido realizar este evento. Bolsa de Santiago.
Y el Matt Varrofex.
Dentro.
GARP.
Risk.
SS&C Algorithmic.
MathWorks.
Calypso.
Axiom SL.
Murex.
Fund Society.
Y Global Risk Community. De verdad, continuamos ahora con los cursos y talleres y les agradecemos pues a todos nuestros patrocinadores que hacen posible la realización de este evento. Y continuamos con los cursos y talleres. Les recordamos también no perderse el keynote speech de Tom Harding, The Insider Story of Tipper X, a las 5:15 p.m. hora México.
Los esperamos.
Hasta pronto.